Hello, everybody. My name is Mariusz Skrobala. I'm a publicist and political activist from Poland. And today, joining me once more, a renowned author, Charles Coulombe. Hello, sir.
Hello, Marius. Good to see you. Good to be
It's a
back.
great pleasure. Yeah, it's a great pleasure and honor to have you here once more. Thank you.
Yeah, glad to help.
Yes, and I think you're the best person I could talk about the subject that we are going to mention today. And the subject is the Habsburg family, the House of Habsburg. So, one of the most important and significant families in the history of Europe. And my idea is that the history of last at least 500 years would not look the same if not that family. They were the Holy Roman Emperors, and Holy Roman Empire was the central and most important state in the history of Europe for at least 1000 years until its dissolution in 1806 by the order of Napoleon. And Habsburg are also well known as the great defenders of Catholic faiths. Yes?
Definitely. And you take the Habsburgs together with the Bourbons, and you've practically got the whole of Europe. And certainly the marriages between them were inevitably, what's the word, for good or for ill, marriages between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons were inevitably hugely historic. And it's it's an amazing story, really, because they began as a little family descended from Charlemagne and the female line in Switzerland,
Yeah.
in the Argau. That's where the Castle Habsburg is. That's where they got their name from. And the first of them that we know of by name was a fellow back in the 900s called Gontran the Rich, presumably because he had money, would be my guess. Uh, but they grew in power and in importance in Switzerland, and they became very, very loyal assistants of the House of Hohenstaufen, who were
Yeah.
the Holy Roman Emperors. Well, unfortunately for the Hohenstaufens, they became extinct. Uh, but before they did, another family became extinct, and these were the Babenbergs,
Mhm.
who dwelt way off in the east of the empire, literally on the eastern march, the eastern border, the Ostmark. And when the Babenbergs died out, as was the custom, not just with the Holy Roman Empire, but with any feudal kingdom, when a noble house died out, the monarch chose somebody to replace them. So in this case, the Hohenstaufen emperor chose Rudolf von Habsburg to replace the Babenbergs.
Mhm.
Now, the Austria that he came to was much smaller than what we know today, and yet it had a lot of the same institutions, especially the monasteries. And in time, the Habsburgs and Austria molded each other. Uh, with very, very few exceptions, the emperors, the Habsburg heads of house tended to be very, very devout, especially devoted to the monasteries and to shrines. And you see the mark of that all over Central Europe, even in places like Switzerland where they haven't been for quite a while. Well, they in the 1200s, as I say, the House of Hohenstaufen died out. It was about 25 years of chaos, the interregnum, as it was called. They had emperors were elected, but they didn't have a territorial base. So Richard of Cornwall was the brother of the King of England. Alfonso of Spain was a Castilian prince, and they had no hereditary lands in the center to really hang themselves on. So everything went haywire. But eventually, the electors selected Rudolf as emperor, and in 1274 he became the first Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor. Now, the next couple of centuries, Habsburgs alternated with other families, Wittelsbach, Luxembourg,
Yeah.
etc., until in 14, well, I'm bad with dates, late 1480s, I think, 1490s, Maximilian I, the last knight of Europe, they called him, was elected Holy Roman Emperor. Well, already they had a saying, let others make war, you, O happy Austria, marry. And so the Habsburgs had married the last heiresses to the thrones of Bohemia, Hungary, Poland. I mean, so Bohemia had already come under their rule by this time. And they were in lines to the throne, both the Jagiellon in Poland and the Hungarian kings. Well, Maximilian made a real incredible marriage. He married a lady called Mary of Burgundy,
Yeah.
and she was the daughter of the last Duke of Burgundy, who controlled what are now the Netherlands, Belgium, Alsace, and a lot of territories stretching between Switzerland and the North Sea. All of that, plus the headship of the Golden Fleece, came to the House of Habsburg
Yeah.
with that
She was
marriage.
very rich, Maria of Burgundy. Yeah.
She was extremely rich, and of course, the King of France was keen on marrying her, but he didn't get the chance. And they were, the House of Burgundy were a younger line of the House of Valois, who were the royal family of France.
Of course. Yeah.
So these folks are all intermarried. I know people like to talk about inbreeding and all that. It really was rarely quite as wild as they say, but they were all interconnected, which is what led to both often enough to peace and sometimes to war.
Yeah.
But at any rate, what should happen but that Mary of Burgundy and Maximilian produced a son called Philip of Burgundy,
Mhm.
and he marries the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the kings of Castile and Aragon, who had united Spain. Uh, their daughter was called Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But nobody called her that for her taste in men, because Philip of Burgundy was also called Philip the Handsome.
Yeah.
So they married, and they produced a son who became Charles I of Spain.
Yeah.
1517, his uh, Austrian grandfather dies. And there's an election because the Holy Roman Empire was not a hereditary monarchy at this point. It was elected. And that election of 1517 is an important one because it shows by the fact that both Henry VIII of England and Francis II of France ran for the post against Charles, against Carlos.
Mhm.
It shows that the what was seen then as the role of the Holy Roman Emperor as presiding over all of Christendom.
Mhm.
Obviously, they couldn't have run for the office if they hadn't been part of the whole. So anyway, they were defeated, and Charles I became the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And under him, they came the closest to regaining, to achieving the idea of the universal monarchy that they had in recent centuries. Unfortunately, he also won the undying enmity of the French under Francis I. And for 200 years, that enmity would plague Europe, it would plague Catholic Europe. It would allow the Protestant revolt to succeed.
Yeah.
It would open the gate to the Turkish invasion because the French supported the Turks and the Protestants, not at home. Now, to be sure, it's no wind that blows nobody any good, as we say in English. And the current day position of the Christians in the Holy Land is actually due to the alliance of France with Turkey,
Yeah.
because there was a price to be paid by the Turks for that alliance. And the price was the French became the protectors of the holy places. So, at any rate, long and the short of it is that when the emperor became the great protector of the church against the Protestants, and he convoked the Council of Trent. Now, from Nicaea until Trent, every major ecumenical council had been convoked by the emperor of the day. Vatican I would be the first one that wasn't.
Going a little bit back, you've mentioned the Hohenstaufen dynasty. And in my opinion, there's a difference between them and the Habsburgs.
Oh,
Because Hohenstaufen were famous for their wars, for their aggressive attitude. They were in a great conflict with the church. Frederick II, the famous emperor from this dynasty, was excommunicated by the Pope, as was his grandfather, the famous Frederick Barbarossa. On the other hand, you said very well that the Habsburgs tended to enlarge their dominions by marriage, not
by
by
marriage.
an aggressive war.
Yeah, and of course the Habsburgs are with us, and the Hohenstaufens aren't. So that might tell you something.
Mm.
The Frederick II was called the Stupor Mundi,
Yeah,
and
the wonder of the world. Yeah.
wonder of the world. And despite his conflicts with various popes, it's interesting that in his law code, heresy is a terrible crime. So, one of the things we tend to forget when we look back at that era, the Guelphs versus the Ghibellines and all that, is that actually both sides agreed on basic principles.
Yes.
It was the application of them to particular cases
Yeah.
that led to conflict. This was a world of difference between those conflicts and the Protestant revolt and what came after.
Mm.
Because again, even Dante, who was certainly one of the most foremost defenders of the rights of the emperor against the Pope, was an absolute defender of the headship of the church by the Pope.
Yes.
And that's why, for instance, he puts Philip, although he doesn't like Boniface VIII and puts him in hell, he puts Philip the Fair there too because of his abuse of Boniface.
Yeah.
So, again, we can't look at these things quite the same way that we would like to, that we look at today. I mean, another example is that during the Pope's fight with Frederick Barbarossa,
Mhm.
his ally was the Byzantine emperor.
Mm. Yeah.
But we were supposed to be in schism for over 75 years. So obviously, that schism did not mean to that Pope and that Byzantine emperor what they mean to us in retrospect.
Yes.
And so that's why we always have to, as when we look at history, we've got to remember that things don't always mean to them, didn't always mean to them what they mean to us, and
Mm.
vice versa. Anyway, so jumping forward, Charles V did the very best he could. Under him, the American colonies were settled. They began to be settled. Cuba, Santo Domingo, Puerto Rico, uh, and his was the very first empire upon which men would say the sun never sets,
Yeah.
because it was a worldwide empire. Well, he was exhausted when he retired. He abdicated and was just totally exhausted.
Yeah.
So he said there's no way that he was going to do that to his heirs. So he divided his empire, the whole Roman Empire and Central Europe and Hungary, which he had inherited in 1526, when the Turks killed the Louis II at the Battle of Mohacs. The Habsburgs inherited the throne of what was left of Hungary, and it wasn't a lot.
Mm.
So the capital moved from Székesfehérvár to Pozsony, Pressburg, Bratislava, which is why the Hungarian kings would be crowned there forever until Franz Joseph's time. Um, but at any rate, he was king of Hungary. All that goes to his brother Maximilian II. To his son Philip II goes Spain, the Italian territories, and the Americas. And Philip II founds, or under him, is founded the first permanent European settlement in the United States, St. Augustine, Florida.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So when you're thinking of the founding fathers of the U.S., they're really Philip II, Henry IV of France, and James the First of England. But because they're the ones we got our first settlements under. But the the fun thing about all this is that the Spanish Habsburgs completed the work. I mean, Under them, Texas was settled, New Mexico,
Yeah.
the Florida, of course, we mentioned, and they played a big role in the history of the United States. The two sets of cousins, the Austrian and Spanish Habsburgs, continued to intermarry, and they also married with the House of Bourbon, and that led to the great crisis when the main line of the Spanish Habsburgs died out, and this was the War of Spanish Succession.
Yeah.
In the United States, we call that Queen Anne's War,
Mm-hmm.
because like the War of the Grand Alliance that we call King William's War, when it happened in the 1680s, this war, War of Austrian Succession, the Seven Years' War, these were all world wars in the Age of Sail. They were fought in Europe, in the Americas, in India, on the high seas, in Africa. These were world wars, and so when Europe brought the faith and civilization to the rest of the world, but she also brought these terrible conflicts.
Yeah.
So, at any rate, the end of the Spanish succession saw the Spanish Empire go to the Spanish Bourbon. That left the Habsburgs of Austria to concentrate on Central Europe. And so they did. Unfortunately, they became extinct in the male line in 1745, 4.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, Carl VI died. He only had a daughter. And immediately the vultures gathered. But she was a tough lady, was Maria Theresa.
Yeah.
She married out of love. She married the Duke of Lorraine. She had 18 children to make sure that what had happened would never happen again. And so from that time to this, it's called the House of Habsburg Lorraine.
Lorraine, yeah.
But she she appeared before the Hungarian nobility, and a Hungary constitutionally could not have a reigning queen.
Mm-hmm.
So they voted Maria Theresa a man. And as she stood there with her infant son in front of them, they rose, they drew their swords, and cried, Vivat Maria Theresa Rex Noster. Long live Maria Theresa, our king.
Yeah.
So she defeated her enemies, although she did lose a good chunk of land to Frederick the Great. And then in the 1770s, as she was getting older, and her son Joseph II, who was not, he was one of the very few Habsburgs who was not really that devout. That was when, as I'm sure our viewers will know, Russia and Prussia decided the time had come to end Poland.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well, that basically was foreordained between Berlin and St. Petersburg. And so Austria did not want to be left out. And Russia took a strip in the northwest. Prussia took what we call West Prussia.
Yeah.
And Austria took Galicia. That was the first partition of Poland.
Yes.
Maria Theresa felt badly about it, but Joseph II told her, well, if we don't get in on the deal. So that was the beginning of a very dark time for Poland.
Mm-hmm.
Then 20 years later, of course, came the last two partitions, 1793, 1795, which ended Polish sovereignty for a while.
Yeah, and Poland disappeared from the map until the 20th century. Yeah.
Till 1918.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, Maria Theresa died. Joseph II is the Emperor Mozart, glittering court, but he has no children. He's not so much the enemy of the church in the sense of disbelieving as wanting to modernize it,
Mm-hmm.
make it more rational.
Yeah.
So he suppressed all the monasteries that would not take up parish work.
Mm-hmm.
Some because they couldn't, like the Carthusians, others because they wouldn't. He suppressed. He banned pilgrimages, he closed shrines. And one of the things that the Orthodox hold against us in places like Romania and Ukraine and so on, they'll say, well, the Catholics closed down a ton of our monasteries in the 1770s and 80s. Well, that was Joseph II. And he wasn't just closing down Orthodox monasteries.
Hmm.
So when they dumped that on the Catholics, this is very, very unjust. At any rate, Joseph II died. He was replaced by his brother Leopold, and then the French Revolution broke out.
Hmm.
The emperor's sister was, of course, married to Louis XVI. Her name was Marie Antoinette. She and her husband both lost their heads. The terrible time of the Napoleonic Wars came. Finally, you have the Congress of Vienna, and the Emperor of France, who had been Holy Roman Emperor until 1806, in 1804 created the hereditary Empire of Austria,
Hmm.
knowing that the Holy Roman Empire was going to be snatched sooner or later. So, sure enough, 1806, he abdicates as Holy Roman Emperor, declares it dissolved, although, of course, legally he couldn't really do that.
Hmm.
And the legal opinion is that somehow the empire survives as a sort of disembodied spirit. But nevertheless, there's no emperor of that. There was, however, the Austrian emperor. And so Franz II, Holy Roman Emperor, becomes Franz I, Austrian emperor.
Hmm.
After the Congress of Vienna, Austria is one of the five great powers who are allied to maintain the peace in Europe. And that system will hold together, actually not that long, only until about 1830.
Hmm.
Revolution in France, you have a liberal monarchy, and the British had already withdrawn from the
Yeah.
system. So it was a pretty sad thing. Uh, Franz dies in 1832. He's replaced by his son Ferdinand, who's a nice man
Hmm.
and very good with math, but not very. He wasn't stupid, but he wasn't.
Yeah.
Let's just say he didn't react well to challenges. So 1848, revolutions all
Yeah.
across Europe, from France to Poland and into Russia.
Hmm.
The Habsburg crown is teetering. All the peoples are revolting, and in the case, the Poles and the Ruthenians, Ukrainians, are going after each other. The Hungarians are revolting. The Austrians are. Everyone's revolting. In the midst of this, the Habsburg family council decided that Ferdinand wasn't up to it, so they prevailed on him to abdicate and on his younger brother to give up his rights. The younger brother's son, at the age of 19, became the Emperor Franz Joseph.
Yeah.
And Franz Joseph was a remarkable man. You might say there are several parts of him. As the 19-year-old who came to power in the midst of utter chaos, he knew who to choose. So his prime minister and you might say interior minister was Prince Felix von Schwarzenberg,
Hmm.
Bohemian, very adept. His military commander was the Field Marshal Radetzky von Radetz, and he was Czech. And between them, and with the help of the Russians in suppressing the Hungarian revolt, Austria was restored. And that was a remarkable thing. A few years later, however, 1853, Franz Joseph made what I think you could consider a tremendous blunder. And what that blunder was this. In that year, Britain and France and Turkey went to war with Russia, and Sardinia joined in. Now, why would Sardinia do that? You'll find out. But Sardinia did it to become the ally of Britain and France.
Hmm.
So Russia, having helped Franz Joseph suppress the Hungarian revolt, asked for aid. And this was Franz Joseph's great mistake. He refused it. Radetzky said, "Send me with a squadron of hussars, and we'll have fulfilled honor. There's not much the British and the French can do to us anyway. But if we don't do this, sire, there'll be terrible repercussions." Well, the old man was right, because Austria stayed neutral. But remember Sardinia allying with Britain and France. Well, at the time, because of the Congress of Vienna, Austria was the predominant power in Germany and in Italy. But two men arose to challenge Austrian supremacy: Bismarck and Cavour.
Yeah.
In 1859, Cavour, the Prime Minister of Sardinia, convinces France to attack Austria. They defeat the Austrians, and that's the beginning of what's called the Risorgimento. The result is the elimination of Austrian influence in the peninsula. A few years later, 1867 or 66 rather, you have the Austro-Prussian War.
Mhm.
Bismarck leads the Prussians against Austria. They're defeated, and you see both Cavour and Bismarck did something that Austria was incapable of: huge taxation and an incredible amount of conscription.
Yeah.
And this was done specifically for the purpose of creating a unified Italy, a unified Germany. What's interesting, there are certain things in history, where despite what people will say, you look at a simple fact and it blows it all apart.
Mhm.
So, for instance, we know that the Habsburg arrangements in Italy and Germany were terrible and awful. Yeah, except that prior to 1870, when the unification of Italy was completed, there was virtually no immigration from Italy. Afterwards, millions of Italians left. Millions. For Argentina, for the United States,
Yeah.
Canada, Australia. And as a rule, we can see this with our own history in the United States. People do not emigrate
Mhm.
to strange, far off places if everything's going well for them at home.
Yeah.
They don't. That's why during our own colonial period, the fact that the French, the Spanish, and the Portuguese couldn't get people to emigrate in any great numbers in those countries.
Yeah.
But there was never a problem getting people to come over from the British Isles. It,
Yeah.
it's really it's not that hard. At any rate, I digress. So this put Austria in a terrible position. The following year, he made a deal with the Hungarians called the Ausgleich, and that was the beginning of the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. Now, while this was a good thing in some ways, he was finally crowned King of Hungary,
Mhm.
and the Hungarians had an equal position, you might say. It's a downside. The downside was this: in 1848, when Kossuth declared the Hungarian Republic and made Magyar rather than Latin the state language, the Slovaks, the Croats, the Serbs, the Romanians in Hungary rose in favor of the dynasty. And you might say they rose in favor of the Holy Crown of St. Stephen.
Mhm.
But the party that dominated Hungary, the Liberal Party, as opposed to the Catholic Party, which were, in my humble opinion, much better, the Liberal Party, led by the Tisa family, um, imposed a program of Magyarization. And that created a great deal of resentment on the part of these nationalities who, after all, had fought for the dynasty,
Yeah.
only to be turned over to the heirs of Kossuth. If the Catholic Party and the Zicsis had dominated Hungary, I think it would have been a lot different and a lot more harmonious. But they didn't. It wasn't. It isn't. It's interesting that one of the great opposition parties to Fidesz today in Hungary is
Mhm.
called the Tisa Party.
Okay.
So I'd hope any Hungarians listening bear that in mind. At any rate, I digress. So that was the setup for Austria-Hungary. Getting there was a huge problem for Franz Joseph, and having
Mm.
achieved it, he wanted no change. Well, unfortunately, Franz Joseph suffered a great many personal tragedies. His brother Maximilian had been asked by the conservatives of Mexico to become Emperor of Mexico as early as 1858.
Mhm.
When the French invaded Mexico, he finally saw there was a chance of it succeeding, so he accepted.
Mhm.
Rather than leave Mexico when the French left, he'd fallen in love with the country, and he was murdered by Benito Juarez and his men. But what's
Yes.
interesting, two of his generals died with him, and they were offered the chance to defect for their lives,
Mhm.
and they wouldn't do it.
Hmm.
And it tells you something about the nature of Maximilian, that these two closest generals who could have saved their lives chose to die with him instead.
That's the meaning of duty and honor in the old traditional world of Europe.
It certainly is, and it shows you something about Maximilian, that he inspired it in those who knew him best.
Mhm.
So, so Maximilian is murdered in 1867. In 1889, his only son Rudolph is either murdered or commits suicide with his mistress at a place called Meyerling.
Mhm.
In 1898, his wife is murdered on a ferry boat in Switzerland. Well, she dies afterwards, but she's stabbed there. One thing after another. And as the years went by, he became this sort of image of endless duty,
Mhm.
almost a machine going on and on and on and on. And a little bit like Queen Elizabeth II in our time, or Queen Victoria at that period, except that unlike those two, he took a very ready stand in the affairs of state.
Mhm.
And Theodore Roosevelt, after he stepped down as President of the United States, visited him in 1905 and asked him what he considered his role to be as a modern monarch. And he said, protecting my people from their politicians.
Yes, a very famous quote. Yeah.
Famous quote that cannot be repeated often enough. And the reason why monarchy is so universally despised today
Mhm.
is because we're so completely politicized.
No.
We're so completely owned by the political classes.
Mhm.
And lest you think that only be a matter of monarchs,
Mhm.
I had occasion in writing a piece for Washington's birthday, which is coming up next week,
Mhm.
to reread his farewell address, in which he warns of the evils of the party system and how it inevitably leads to despotism.
Yeah.
I think I think that the history of the world, and especially modern history, is proof positive. But anyway,
Uh,
moving along.
If I could add something here,
Of course,
I think the problem lies on also in this that modern liberal democratic societies they hate hierarchy and order. And when they think about monarchy, they think automatically about hierarchy. And hierarchy is something that modern society just hates, yeah? Because
but
equality is on the altar.
it says that, but it
Mm.
also, to get a little psychological, it projects.
Okay.
Because what you find about liberals in power
Mhm.
is that they see power purely as something with which they can smack their enemies around.
Mhm.
For them, a system wherein an individual has power,
Mhm.
but it's guided by authority, that's incomprehensible.
Yeah. Mhm.
If I'm in charge, I run the show, and I can do anything I want because I run the show. And all their mouthing about equality goes right out the window.
Yeah. Mhm.
You know, but and of course the people who don't know any better, uh, they go, well, gee, I guess I could vote, so I
Yeah.
guess I mean something.
Yeah.
Well, no, you
Yes.
don't. If you vote the wrong way in a referendum, there'll be another referendum on the same topic in a year or two until you
Mhm.
get it right.
Yeah.
If you vote for the wrong president, well, we'll either make his life hell or we'll just annul the election.
Yes, so we could say that hierarchy is natural, but in liberal democracy, the problem lies within the elites. They are fake
Well,
elites. That's the problem.
they are both Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas
Mhm.
said that there were three sorts of government, three kinds of good government, and there are three evil shadows, as you might say.
Oh, very well.
So there was monarchy, the first kind of good government, ruled by one man for the sake of the common good. The second was aristocracy, which is ruled by a group for the sake of the common good. And lastly, what they called polity, which was ruled by a majority of what we would call stakeholders, landowners, taxpayers, veterans. In other words, people who actually contributed to the common good. And then, said both Aristotle and St. Thomas, the best kind of government is one that combines all three. And in the Middle Ages, and up until in different countries at different times, it ended. But up until the modern era, the early modern era, the king and the estates, the king and the upper house and the lower house, whatever you want to call it, that was seen as embodying this mixed government. Well, each of those three had an evil twin. The evil twin of monarchy was despotism or tyranny.
Yeah.
The evil twin of aristocracy was oligarchy. That's the fake elite to which you referred.
Oh, yeah.
And again, each ruling for its own interest.
Yes.
The monarch rules for the common good, the tyrant or the despot rules for his own. The aristocracy rules for the common good, the oligarchy for its own. And versus the polity, what they called democracy, which was not a nice word.
Yes.
And it meant mob rule. Now, I've said that these theorists, St. Thomas, Aristotle, and all that, they thought the best kind of government was a mixed government of the three best kinds. They never even talked about something we have achieved, which is a mixed government of the three terrible kinds. But we, all of us, in just about every country on earth today, managed to combine tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy.
Yes, exactly.
See, they never even thought of that. We did that ourselves. We should be so proud. Oh,
Yeah.
the very thought of it, I get excited.
How Western civilization, the European civilization looks after that.
It's, well, I mean, all you have to do is remember COVID.
Yeah.
You know, we're little toys to be put back in the box and taken out again when our masters say so, whoever they may be.
Yes.
Because we're not quite sure of that either. A mad world, my masters. But at any rate, so Franz Joseph then, his next brother after Maximilian, Karl Theodor, died. He went to the Holy Land. He was very devout, made the mistake of drinking from the Jordan River. And that it killed him. He got back to Austria before he did, but it killed him. He had two sons. The one was Franz Ferdinand, who had been very sick when he was young, and they didn't think he would live, but he did, became very athletic. And Otto. Now, Otto was a ne'er-do-well. He was very popular in Vienna society. All the women loved him, and he loved a lot of them, which is probably why he ended up dying of syphilis. But the price to be paid for everything.
Yeah.
But these two brothers then became the respective heirs. Well, now we're in the 1890s, late 90s. Franz Ferdinand has finally decided he wants to get married. Unfortunately, it's a marriage of love of a lady named Countess Kotek, Sophie Countess Kotek, who's a Czech noblewoman, but she's not royal. So there's a big, big fight over it. Now, one of the myths you'll hear is that Franz Ferdinand hated the Magyars. Not true at all. Hated the Tisas, hated the Liberal Party. That's true. But when he was in Győr in Western Hungary with the army, that was where he learned Magyar. And the priest who taught him Magyar, whose name was, oh man. Ladies and gentlemen, I hate it when this happens. I can't think of his name, which is a pity because he was the one who had the prophetic dream. Lanier, Joseph Lanier, that was it. Father Lanier taught Franz Ferdinand Magyar, and he would wander in the streets without an escort. So the people of the town called him our Archduke. Well, that's all very nice, but he marries Countess Kotek, and his children can't inherit. Now, what Franz Ferdinand wanted to do, and one reason why the Tisas hated him, was that he wanted to federalize the empire. So that instead of being Austria and Hungary, it would be sort of a United States of Greater Austria. They probably would have had to come up with another name like Danubia or something. But at any rate, that was the plan. He also didn't particularly like the system of alliances that Franz Joseph was left with, which was basically Italy, who couldn't be trusted, and Germany, who, much as Franz Ferdinand liked the Kaiser personally, he also knew that the Kaiser was no longer really in charge in Germany. And incidentally, this became manifest in 1905, because in that year, the Kaiser and his first cousin, the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, went on a cruise. So they were very good friends. They were first cousins and very fond of each other. Well, in the midst of all this, they decide, bear in mind that each of them are members of the two alliances. There's the Triple Entente, which is Britain, France, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance, which is Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy. So they signed, while they were on board together, a treaty of alliance between the two countries, which included the alliance and peace between them, which included an article requiring them both to attempt to get their respective allies to join, which would have been sort of a rebirth of the post-Congress of Vienna. I mean, if you can imagine those 6 countries allying, that would have ensured the peace of Europe for God knows how long.
Yeah.
But there were powerful forces that did not want peace in Europe for reasons I'll explain momentarily. So they went back to their respective capitals, and both of their governments immediately denounced the treaty. So that tells you that they were no longer in charge of their respective countries.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing to understand when people are running around trying to assign blame for the Great War. Now, I've said there were forces against it. Well, there were. And you don't have to get all strange and conspiratorial. Every country had a war party and a peace party. The reason for the peace party, I probably shouldn't have to explain. But the reason for the war party was that each country in Europe, each major country, had a lot of social stresses. The proletariat, the difficulties of the socialists. I mean, there was all sorts of divisions going on.
Yeah.
And for a lot of fairly short-sighted politicians, a war was the best way to end all that. We get everybody together behind the flag.
Yeah.
We march in lockstep to a greater future. Well, yeah. In Russia, the leader of the peace party was the one-time prime minister, Pyotr Stolypin, who was shot and murdered in 1912. The leader of the peace party in Austria-Hungary was Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
And we know what his death started.
Yes, indeed. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they'll be shot to death. But by morons. But the sad thing there too is that the assassination of Franz Ferdinand was ordered not, to be honest and to be fair, by the Serbian government, but by the chief of the Serbian secret police, a man whose actual name I can never remember, but whose code name was Apis, A-P-I-S. And if you look up Serbian secret police Apis, you'll find out all about him. This man had been responsible for a coup in Belgrade and the murder of the then king and queen of Serbia. He had brought over their rivals, the Karađorđevićes, so he was a power to be reckoned with. But the Serbs, in the end, would execute them themselves in 1917. If they'd handed them over to the Austrians in 1914, we'd have saved a lot of trouble. But the problem was that the Serbian government was facing elections in November of 1914, and they couldn't afford to look weak in front of Austria to their people. So you might say that if you want to assign blame for the war, it's the great political classes. It was another triumph for democracy.
Yeah.
It was suckling for votes. It was political short-sightedness.
And First World War was the cause or the end of the European monarchies. And
Well,
what
the big ones.
Yeah. And what's your opinion about the role that the United States played in it? Because in the 20th century, United States were the biggest exporter of mass democracy, and they didn't want monarchies in Europe. Were the policy of United States the final nail to the coffin of European monarchies?
Well, it was, and not just European. And I'll explain what I mean by that. In 1898, we went to war with Spain.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting that the Queen Regent of Spain at that time, Queen Maria Cristina, appealed to the monarchies of Europe. And she said, "We are only the first victim. If you don't back us up, you'll go through the same thing yourselves." Well, she was right. We became a world power. We tipped the balance of power in World War I. 1918, Woodrow Wilson throws out the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns. The Romanovs are already gone. No less than Winston Churchill, whom you could hardly accuse of being pro-Austrian or pro-German. He declared that, in fact, it was Wilson's insistence on getting rid of the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns and the Wittelsbachs and the Wettins and all the rest of them that led directly to the rise of Hitler and then ultimately the absorption of Central Europe by Stalin. So if you wonder where your 50 or 60 years under communism came from, you can make a pilgrimage to Woodrow Wilson's tomb at the Washington National Cathedral and leave a hammer and sickle or something. But at any rate, well, some token of appreciation. After but so we continued with this. World War II. Initially, Otto von Habsburg was a major advisor to Roosevelt, and it's to a great degree his doing that Austria is an independent country now and not part of Germany. But Roosevelt liked Stalin, and he hated monarchies. So what happened? Well, we backed Tito against King Peter in Yugoslavia. And so the Chetniks were destroyed by the partisans. The British actually were the ones who saved the Greek royal family in the Civil War. We certainly weren't keen on that. We did nothing to help King Michael, despite the fact in Romania, despite the fact that he had single-handedly deposed Antonescu on his own. And of course, we did nothing for the Italian monarchy, despite the fact that Victor Emmanuel III had overthrown Mussolini. In fact, we assisted in the rigged plebiscite that got rid of his son, Umberto II. And you might think, well, gee, that's just Europe just then. But over the ensuing decades, we did everything we could to blast our allies out of their colonial empires. We contributed heavily through the CIA to the overthrow of King Farouk in 1952, somewhat to the overthrow of the King of Iraq in 58. In 1979, as Richard Nixon put it so eloquently, we greased the skids for the Shah of Iran. You notice how none of these did us any good. We encouraged Diem in South Vietnam to get rid of Emperor Bao Dai. And that really worked out well for us, didn't it? But just to show that we haven't learned anything,
Yeah.
1992, the Iron Curtain has fallen. They're talking about restoring King Michael in Romania and King Simeon in Bulgaria. Uh, we veto it. And
Mm.
Mr. Bush Sr. says, you do that, no more foreign aid. So you got what you have now. Under, what's his name? Clinton.
Yeah.
We're in a struggle with Serbia. It's pointed out to our Secretary of State, Madam Albright, that at that time the largest opposition to Milosevic were the monarchists.
Yeah.
And her response was, we don't do kings.
We don't do kings. Yeah, very famous quote. And
Yeah,
I'm
very
thinking about
famous.
one more example. After the Second World War, it's the US that forced the Japanese emperor to officially declare that he is not God.
Absolutely. And there, the only time we ever propped up a monarchy
Mhm.
was then. MacArthur, he was smart enough to know that getting rid of the emperor would
Mm.
make it impossible to deal with Japan. So he
Yeah,
didn't do that. But he did do two things. One, he did have the emperor declare that he wasn't God, which,
yeah.
is nice. But he also introduced abortion into the country's legal system.
Mhm.
And he legalized it in Japan in 48, decades before it became legal in the US.
Yeah.
That's something people don't know and they don't remember, but look it up.
Yes.
It was the American occupation authorities and our redesigned legal system for Japan that legalized abortion in that country. Not that I'm, annoyed. And then
It's in 1948, yes?
1948.
Yeah, because I know well the biography of famous Japanese writer Yukio Mishima,
Yeah,
and he was a great defender of the emperor and Japanese nationalists. As we all know, he committed suicide during the coup d'etat.
yeah.
Uh, and I know that the US forced the emperor to say that he is not God, but I didn't know about that abortion thing.
No, and of course, it makes the abortion thing all the more annoying is that it would be decades before the Supreme Court imposed it on what was then an unwilling population.
Hmm.
But as you know, democracy is all about smacking your subjects around and stepping on them when they're bad, and
Yeah,
occasionally sending them to bed without supper.
yeah,
At any rate, the last of this long trail of nonsense was, in fact, Bush Jr. During shortly after the invasion of Afghanistan, the Loya Jirga was about to restore King Mohammed Zahir Shah to
yeah.
the throne of Afghanistan. And on television, Mr. Bush's personal envoy vetoed it.
Hmm.
Now, I remember thinking that day as I watched all that, I thought, that's it, we just lost the war.
Yeah.
Because there was no way that the Afghans could see the Barzai government as being anything other than a puppet regime.
Yes, exactly.
And, mind you, we struggled on for a couple of decades. You
Mm.
know, God knows how many dead people,
Yeah.
American, Afghan, and others.
Mm.
So you see, our anti-monarchical bias has
Hmm.
brought us so many rewards.
Yeah.
It's been so useful.
Yeah.
It's been so helpful.
Mm.
You know, it's one thing if I'm a thief and I amass a fortune by stealing, but if I don't, and I keep, it keeps ending in disasters for me.
Yeah.
Well, only politicians could not quite catch on. And it's a funny thing about my country. I'll tell you this about the United States. It's very, you might say today, bipolar.
Hmm.
If you want to love my country, absolutely come to adore it.
Yeah.
Come to the United States and take a long road trip. I mean, Americans, see the place. You will be convinced it's the best place you've ever been to in your life.
Hmm.
If you want to hate my country, study the history of our foreign policy.
Yes. Yes.
You will think we are the devil's own daughters.
Yes.
I mean, it really the the disconnect between the reality of the nation
Hmm.
and what is done in its name.
Yes.
Could not be greater. And the fact that the generality of Americans are completely unaware
Yeah.
of this.
Yeah.
I mean, our dealings with Latin America was sort of a
Mhm.
prequel because there, from the 1820s, when we first started intervening in Mexico, all the way down to the present, we always intervened on the anti-Catholic, anti-clerical side for
Mhm.
their benefit, always. Uh,
Yes, but I'm thinking that someone has to be an architect of this foreign policy, and I'm thinking that there's a huge division in the United States between the interior and the liberal elites on the coasts. Yeah.
well, to a degree, but part of it is also cultural
Mhm.
because we Americans, ultimately we're sort of a secularized Calvinist people.
No.
The religious element's gone, but what has remained is the messianic sense, the idea that we're the chosen people,
Mhm.
and that other peoples are good to the degree that they resemble us, and
Mhm.
to the degree that they don't, they're Canaanites.
Yeah.
And this isn't conscious. That's what makes it all the worse. I mean, if it were conscious, you could actually
Yeah.
deal with it, but it's not. And so we have this very evangelical attitude. Now they call that American exceptionalism,
Yeah.
and to a great degree, it now has a sort of rival sect, the wokery.
Mhm.
And for the woke, instead of the United States being the greatest country that ever has been, the shining city on the hill, the last best hope of mankind,
Yeah.
it's the worst nation that ever was,
Mhm.
born in genocide and built in slavery.
Yeah.
But here's the funny thing, it's the flip side of the same ideal, and it is just as evangelical, which is why the Biden regime and the Obama regime were just as pushy with gay stuff and all that
Yeah.
in the third world as as the
Yeah.
other side are about other things.
Yeah, but I also like to look at woke as a new version of neo-Marxism communism with its hatred towards the Western civilization. It's trying to undermine and destroy everything. Woke, specifically the biological side of a man. Don't you think so?
Well, I'd agree, and of course, again, if you look back over the sweep of history from the
Mhm.
Protestant revolt down to the present, you see sort of a series of revolutions. First, we had the revolution against the altar, then the revolution against the throne,
Yes.
then what you might call a revolution against culture, and
Hmm.
now what you have is a revolution against reality itself.
Yeah, and man himself as a biological being having some kind of sex, not choosing the sex, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, you come to a point now. The only thing next is to declare war on gravity.
Yeah, yeah. In general, it's a kind of civilizational suicide, a mass suicide of a civilization, yeah? Don't you think so?
It is, and but bear in mind how long it's taken.
Hmm.
I mean, it's taken the strength of that civilization, because don't forget, all during that time, it hasn't just been decline.
Yeah.
Lots of good things have been produced,
Hmm.
because the strength was still there.
Hmm.
But unfortunately, the decision making
Yeah.
became more and more insane.
Hmm.
And now, you know, it's interesting to me that Mr. Vance, when he was in Munich,
Yeah.
gave a wonderful dose of reality to the European leadership.
Yes.
But there's no way Mr. Trump would achieve would have the same kind of realism regarding the United States, abortion, gay marriage, etc.
Yeah.
And of course, if Vance does this, he's highly unlikely to be president number 48.
Hmm.
Because one of the things we've got to bear in mind is that a lot of us have become terribly corrupt ourselves.
Hmm.
One of the myths of democracy is the idea that somehow the masses of people are inherently virtuous. Well, they're not.
Never been.
No, because it's the nature of man to follow his leadership.
Hmm.
If your leaders are corrupt, then a lot of the people will be corrupt.
Yes.
And then of the portion that aren't, only a small percentage are ever heroes, you know, and a small percentage of them are martyrs. So one of the things when people talk to me about, the Nazis and how could people get along with that, or the communists, in Eastern Europe and Central Europe and Russia, I put it to them this way: 50 years ago, when I was a boy, the vast majority of Americans thought that abortion was murder, and there was no question about it.
Yes.
What if 50 or 60 years from now, it's that way again? How will they look at us? If they ask me, how did you oppose it, Great Uncle Charles?
Yeah.
Well, how am I going to answer? I wasn't on Operation Rescue. I paid my income tax and supported abortion like everyone else.
Yes.
Where did I stand up? Well, the answer is I really haven't.
Mm.
I don't like it, but it's more important to me to maintain a comfortable life and so on and so forth than to really put myself out for a cause I believe in. And that is your real democracy. That's where the vast majority of people are.
Yes.
And so when views change radically,
Mm.
their children, their grandchildren, their great grandchildren will turn around and look at them like they're insane. Like how
Yeah.
could you do that? Well, because that's how it was.
Yeah. The situation is even worse at the moment because we have a demographical crisis in the West, in Europe also. So
Yes.
there could be no next generations that could look at the forefathers. This is maybe the end, yeah?
Well, I maybe not. I mean, one thing about Europeans, and this is why I have a great deal of hope for them,
Mhm.
even naturally speaking. Supernaturally speaking, of course, I always have hope. Always.
Yeah.
I had a discussion some years ago with a French royalist politician. We had lunch in
Mhm.
Paris.
Mhm.
This is 25, 30 years ago, but I stand by what I said then.
Mhm.
The situation looked fairly bleak. And he said, "Do you see any hope?" And I said, "Well, of course, as a Catholic, there's always hope. But beyond that, let's pretend that you and I were Augustine and Ambrose talking about the state of the Roman Empire. It looks pretty bad.
Mhm.
And humanly speaking, there's not a lot to hope for.
Yes.
You and I, you, Ambrose, and me, Augustine, we could not possibly have foreseen Clovis. It just couldn't. I mean, totally off the radar screen.
Yeah.
But, but, if you, Ambrose, and I, Augustine, had not done what we did,
Yeah, there could be no.
there would be no Clovis.
Yeah.
So when you look at these things and you're tempted to throw your hands up in the air,
Mhm.
remember that God is still in charge,
Mhm.
and that all of us, in our ridiculous, silly attempts, try to do our part. Well, some of that he'll use for something. We can't know what. You know, it's hard to tell what the future will hold, but this much I know, and this is the natural source of hope.
Yeah.
Europeans can turn on a dime,
Mhm.
absolutely on a dime. Americans are much slower. But I mean, if you compare the Germany of the 20s to the Germany of the 40s, I'm
Mhm.
not saying it was an improvement, but it was completely different.
Yes. Yeah.
And then you look at the Germany of the 60s.
You know what? I'm thinking that there's a tragic thing in all of it because 1,000 years of European history, starting from Charlemagne, it's the rule of monarchies
Yep.
until First World War. Mass liberal democracy is a great experiment, and it's like the masses took over, are in charge of the Western civilization. And the decline of our civilization is started when the masses took over. That's a fact. Every year, every 10 years, it's getting worse and worse.
Well, this is true for the moment.
Mhm.
But again, it wasn't fun stuff during the Black Plague.
Yeah.
It wasn't great during the Magyar invasions. It wasn't great during the Viking invasions.
Yes.
Um, And you know, it's interesting to me that 800, you had Blessed Charlemagne.
Yeah.
1918, you had Blessed Charles the First,
Hmm.
uh, who would have been Charles the Eighth. No, Charles the Seventh. If
Yeah.
no, Charles the Eighth, he would have been had he been Holy Roman Emperor. Uh,
From the House of Habsburg, and you wrote a book about him. Why he's important for you?
well, for a number of reasons. One, because he epitomized the kind of leaders we don't have.
Hmm.
He's almost an Arthurian figure, you know, a latter day knight. I mean, they call Maximilian the First the last knight. That is better applied to Charles the First, Karl the First. Uh, in the short 2 years of his reign, and then the 4 years he lived after that, he epitomized all that was best, he and his wife both, in European leadership. And what's interesting is that during the 19th century, the House of Habsburg spent over $25 million of 19th century money.
Hmm.
So, you know, he a lot, 250 million,
Yeah.
500 million, I don't know, a lot more today, uh, in the United States supporting the Catholic Church in the U.S. They founded 400 parishes in the United States. They bankrolled 300 missionaries, including St. John Neumann,
Hmm.
the first Archbishop of Philadelphia. Um, and of course, we repaid them with Woodrow Wilson, but that's a whole other story. Uh, the thing is that today there are 30 shrines in honor of Blessed Karl in the United States. 30. So he obviously answers something deep in the American character. And so he offers something we need. The Europeans need it too. The difference is that because they lost it much more recently, the pull isn't quite as strong. And of course, in Central Europe, and particularly in Austria, you have an added problem. You have a sort of, for want of a better word, insanity
Yeah.
on the part of the leadership toward the Habsburgs.
Hmm.
Because using Austria as an example, when you can adjust it for Hungary and Czechia and even Poland, if you like, Karl and the Habsburgs had to have been evil. Because if they weren't evil, then Karl Renner or Masaryk or Horthy or, again, then they weren't good. But we base our legitimacy on them. Now, I have to admit, of that whole tribe of Central Europeans, Karl Renner is my favorite. Because this was a man who betrayed his country 3 times. First, he betrays his emperor. Then he sells the country to Hitler. Then he goes to work for Stalin. And he dies as president. I mean, if that isn't the modern person, I don't know what is. It's a
Yes.
beautiful, beautiful story. And the problem is the modern Austrian establishment
Hmm.
is based, their legitimacy in their own, what passes for minds, is based upon the sanctity of Karl Renner.
Yeah.
And so constantly they have to denigrate, even while they get money out of, they have to denigrate the memory of the Habsburgs.
Hmm.
And for that matter, of Dolphus, continually.
Yeah.
The way a thief who's taken something has to continually justify why he has it. This wallet of yours, you know why I've got this? It's because you're a nasty person, and 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 you used to skip school, um, and and you're bad, and you don't like dogs. Well, you know I've got to constantly do it because the fact is I've got your stolen wallet in my hand,
Yeah.
and for all of this, I'm still a thief, and you're still an aggrieved party.
Yeah.
Central Europe, the United States is a different story. There's been a revolution in history writing, historiography in English, both in the United States and Britain, about the Habsburgs and Karl. And my book is just one of many
Yeah.
that have emerged, and many from much more reputable academics than myself,
Yeah.
uh, but not in German or Magyar, etc., because the legitimacy of the modern arrangement lies on the denigration of the House of Habsburg in Central Europe. And the great irony here, in my humble opinion, is that the continued existence of Central Europe as herself requires a somewhat greater unity between her nations.
Mhm.
But only two things have ever been able to accomplish, ever been able to overcome the mutual hatreds of the Central Europeans. One is the Catholic faith,
Mhm.
and two is the House of Habsburg.
Yes.
And it's interesting to me that the major, although some of the biggest attackers of the Habsburgs, and in particular, will come from Poland. The man who is responsible for his beatification was Pope John Paul II.
Yes, John Paul II. Mhm.
There's a reason for that. His father, Sergeant Major Wojtyła,
Mhm.
was a soldier in the Emperor's army,
Yeah. Mhm.
and he knew him much better than most, so he named his son after him.
Yeah.
When John Paul II beatified Emperor Karl, he created his own namesake. And the funny thing is, when he finally met Empress Zita,
Uh-huh.
he said, "It is a great honor at long last to meet my Empress." Now, the relationship of Poland to the House of Habsburg is a whole other issue, but I'll say this much. There had been a party in Krakow in the 1890s and the 1900s. They called them the Jesters. I don't know what that is in Polish. But they hoped to see the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth restored under the House of Habsburg.
Yes.
What's not to like?
And it's such an important royal family for the history of Europe, and there's no history of Europe as we know it without them.
No,
Since the beginning, since they took the Holy Roman Empire, Maximilian the last knight, later Philip II of Spain, who tried to invade England with his great armada. And if
no,
he succeed, the whole history of the world would look differently.
it would have been
Uh,
completely different. Absolutely.
Yes, and unfortunately, the Holy Roman Empire was destroyed by Napoleon, and we should say that Napoleon destroyed a lot of old states in Europe, Republic of Genoa, Republic of
Yeah,
Venice, which had 1,000 years of history, and he was despised and hated by the old aristocracy, the ancient regime, because he installed in the court systems, in the law systems, the achievements of the French Revolution. Yeah, so in fact, he was another part, yeah,
yeah.
of French
Too,
Revolution.
too true, sadly.
Mm.
Uh, I all I can say though is that we haven't seen, God willing, the last of the Habsburgs, and I uh, I can tell you this much:
Mm.
uh, regardless of what we like or what we don't like, at the end of the day, God's will be done. And really, the great question that always faces each of us is, will it be done with our cooperation or in spite of us?
Yeah.
For the politicians of Central Europe from 1916 to 1939, they got what they wanted.
Yes. And,
Now, I don't know if that was a pleasant thing for them, but they got it good and hard. So I think that if it hadn't been for Woodrow Wilson,
mm,
so many Americans, taking just the United States,
yeah.
would not have died in World War II. You know,
Yeah, that's a fact. Yeah.
when we went through this long list, as I said earlier, if it ever did us any good, that would be one thing. But all it's ever been are American lives and American treasure
Yeah.
spent for nothing.
Hmm. So on my side, I encourage anyone to read as much as possible about the Habsburg, because if you want to know the soul of the European civilization, you have to focus on this royal
So
house.
you can't you couldn't do better than studying up on them. They're really an amazing bunch, and of course, you know, Caro Wojtyła liked them.
Yes. Mr. Coulombe, thank you very much for this fascinating talk and your speech about the Habsburg family history. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, and hope to see you again.
Hope
Take
to
care.
talk to you soon. Thank you very much.
Bye bye.